Do you think you know what a medieval castle is? Stone towers, knights in armor, feasts in the great hall, torches on the walls. A pretty picture, comfortable, familiar. This is exactly how those who write textbooks want to see it. But there's a problem. It doesn't align with what the stones themselves tell us. Castles stand all over Europe. Hundreds are officially registered. Thousands if you count ruins and forgotten foundations. They have been studied, described, restored. Thousands of academic papers have been written about them. And despite all this, one simple question still lacks a clear answer. What were they truly built for? Not according to textbooks, but according to common sense. Today we are asking precisely this question, and the answer you will hear won't match any guidebook, nor any tourist castle around the world. There's a saying, every century has its own Middle Ages. It's repeated in conversations, quoted in articles, spoken with a wise air during kitchen debates, and no one really stops to consider what it actually means. It means this: in any era, there will be its own darkness, its own ignorance, its own zone that reason prefers not to enter. In any era, including ours, including right now. But why did the Middle Ages specifically become synonymous with backwardness, filth, and barbarism? Why did this particular period, roughly from the 5th to the 10th century AD, transform into a universal label for everything dark and shameful? The answer you'll get in any textbook sounds something like this: the Inquisition, the plague, feudal fragmentation, the absence of science, the dominance of the church. It's convincing, coherent, and yet only partially true, and in key details, frankly dubious. This relates to the very mechanism of shaping the historical reputation of eras. The Middle Ages didn't get its name in the Middle Ages, it was coined much later. The term medium aevum, meaning Middle Age, was introduced by Italian humanists of the Renaissance, approximately in the 15th century. People who wanted to emphasize their own progressiveness needed a contrast. They needed a dark age against which their own time would appear bright and advanced. The Middle Ages were appointed to this role, and they have played it ever since. Not because they earned it, but because it was convenient for those who wrote history. Look at the facts that don't fit this version. In the 10th century, universities were operating in Europe. Bologna was founded in 1088. Oxford began accepting students around 1096. In the 11th and 12th centuries, cathedrals were built with such engineering complexity that modern architects still cannot definitively explain how medieval builders calculated loads without computer modeling. The Gothic vaults of Chartres Cathedral, the flying buttresses of Notre Dame, the acoustics of St. Mary's Church in Krakow. All of this was created in an era considered a time of complete intellectual decline. Something clearly doesn't add up here. This also applies to medicine, which is often portrayed as a collection of superstitions and witchcraft. Medieval monastic hospitals kept systematic records of patient observations. 10th century surgeons in the Arab world, whose works were actively translated and used in European universities, described operations that formally reappeared in European practice only centuries later. The Middle Ages were heterogeneous, complex, and significantly more developed than the official narrative allows us to admit. So where did this image come from? Filthy streets, toothless peasants, complete lack of sanitation, and intellectual emptiness. Partly from the propaganda of the Enlightenment, which needed a frightening contrast. Partly from Hollywood films, which were cheaper to make when historical accuracy wasn't a concern. And partly from deliberate simplification, which always benefits those who don't want people to ask too many questions about what actually happened. Because if the Middle Ages weren't as dark as we're told, then what exactly happened then? What knowledge existed? What technologies were used? And most importantly, where did it all disappear? This isn't an academic question. It's a question whose answer changes everything else. And it's precisely with this that the conversation about castles begins. Structures that stand in the midst of this era as silent witnesses to something we haven't yet been told. Let's immediately address what most people believe as an obvious fact. The medieval person didn't bathe. The medieval person didn't brush their teeth. The medieval person lived in dirt, stench, and complete indifference to their own body. This image has become so firmly entrenched in the collective consciousness that no one bothers to verify it anymore. It's simply repeated from generation to generation, like a family legend. Except here's the problem. Archaeology, written sources, and elementary artifact analysis say the exact opposite. Medieval baths existed throughout Europe and functioned as fully operational public establishments. In Paris alone, in the 10th century, there were over 60 public baths. And this is according to official tax records of the time. In German cities, bath days were enshrined in city charters as mandatory. Scandinavian sagas describe weekly visits to baths as the norm, not the exception. Arab travelers visiting European cities in the 10th and 11th centuries noted in their chronicles that the locals paid considerable attention to bodily cleanliness. This applies to an entire layer of sources that simply didn't make it into popular historical retellings, because a clean Middle Ages is significantly less profitable as an image than a dirty one. Dental hygiene also existed in the Middle Ages, albeit in different forms. Twigs from walnut and other trees with natural abrasive and antibacterial properties were used, along with mixtures of ground charcoal and salt, and rinses with herbal decoctions. 10th and 11th century monastic medical texts contain detailed instructions for oral care. Analysis of medieval skulls from excavations in Britain and Germany showed that caries occurred significantly less frequently in people of that time than in people in the 19th century, an era considered much more civilized. The reason is simple: there was almost no refined sugar in the diet. This also applies to clothing, which popular depictions portray exclusively as grey, tattered, and permeated with dirt. Medieval dyes were produced from plant and animal sources and yielded rich, lasting colors. Archaeological finds of textiles from Scandinavia, dated to the 10th and 11th centuries, demonstrate complex, multicolored weaving with geometric patterns. Medieval dyers' guilds existed in most major European cities and were among the most affluent professional associations. People cared about their appearance, and they did so systematically. Urban sanitation in medieval cities was imperfect. That's true, but it existed. In 10th century London, there were special officials responsible for street cleanliness. Their position was officially called a swenger, meaning a street sweeper. In several German cities, there were fines for dumping garbage in unauthorized places, recorded in city chronicles. Venice's canal system partially served drainage functions, and city authorities regularly issued decrees for its maintenance. This isn't ideal sanitation, but it's not the primitive dump that's depicted to us. So why did the myth of a dirty Middle Ages prove so resilient? Because it's convenient. It creates a chasm between then and now, making people feel like the pinnacle of civilizational progress. It explains epidemics solely through unsanitary conditions, without raising questions about other possible causes. It portrays the medieval person as a being so primitive that any talk of advanced technologies or developed knowledge of that time automatically seems absurd. And this is where things get interesting. Because if the average medieval town dweller bathed, took care of their clothes, and lived in conditions significantly better than commonly believed, then why did castle inhabitants live in conditions that don't withstand comparison even to the most modest urban housing of that time? Why, in castles, the main symbols of the era's power and might, did dirt, stench, and a complete lack of basic infrastructure prevail? This contradiction is not explained by poverty or ignorance. It requires a completely different explanation. However, everything said above about baths, about dyers, about city cleaners and monastic medical texts doesn't apply to castles at all, not in the slightest degree. A castle is not a medieval city. A castle is not a monastery. A castle is not a merchant's house in Lubeck or Venice. A castle stands apart from the entire picture of well-maintained, organized, quite functional medieval life that serious historical science portrays. And this is not an accident that can be attributed to climate or geography. This is a systemic anomaly that can be traced across Europe, from Scotland to the Balkans, from Portugal to Poland. Take any major medieval castle with a documented history of habitation, and you will find the same picture. The Tower of London, construction of which began in 1066 under William the Conqueror, served for centuries as a royal residence, arsenal, and place of detention. Chronicles describe the conditions inside as extremely harsh. Dampness, cold, lack of proper ventilation, and constant problems with waste removal. And this was a royal residence, not a prison cell or barracks, but the official dwelling of the monarch. Conwy Castle in Wales, built at the end of the 13th century under Edward I and considered one of the finest examples of medieval military architecture, reveals upon closer inspection a complete absence of any centralized waste disposal system. Archaeologists record traces of years of accumulated organic waste directly at the base of the inner courtyard walls. This applies to castles across Europe without exception. Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, the very fairy tale castle that became the model for Disney's logo, was completed in 1886 and was already equipped with all the technical innovations of its time, including running water and central heating. But that's the 19th century. Real medieval castles are a completely different story. Bodiham Castle in Sussex, England, dated to 1385, showed upon detailed examination that the system of garderobe niches opening directly into the moat was the only sanitary solution for the entire garrison. The moat, which logically should have served as a defensive obstacle, effectively turned into an open repository for the waste of several dozen, if not hundreds of people. This also applies when comparing it to what was being built nearby at the same time. Medieval monasteries, contemporaries of most European castles, demonstrate a fundamentally different approach to infrastructure. Cluny Abbey in Burgundy, one of the largest religious complexes in medieval Europe, had a well-designed water supply and sewage disposal system built as early as the 10th century. Canterbury Cathedral Priory had an extensive network of water pipes, a detailed plan which has survived to this day and amazes with its technical sophistication. Arab cities of the same period, Cordoba, Baghdad, Cairo, had centralized water supply and sewage systems serving hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. Against this backdrop, the European medieval castle looks not just modest, it looks like an object for which the issue of sanitary infrastructure was not considered significant at all during its construction. Herein lies the paradox that doesn't fit into any standard historical scheme. A castle is a structure built with immense labor and resources. The construction of an average European castle took from 5 to 20 years and required the labor of hundreds and sometimes thousands of people. It was a colossal investment project by the standards of any era. The people who could afford such construction had sufficient resources to solve any engineering problem, including sewage. They knew how it was done. The monasteries near their castles prove this. And yet, they didn't build proper toilets, didn't install plumbing, didn't organize waste removal. Why? The standard answer from historians is roughly this. The castle was primarily a military structure, not a residential one, so comfort was not a priority. It sounds reasonable until you start counting, because people lived in castles permanently for decades, with entire families, servants, guests. These were not temporary field camps. They were permanent residences of feudal lords who by their status stood above all other inhabitants of the region. And it was these people, possessing maximum resources and maximum power who lived in conditions worse than an ordinary monk in a neighboring monastery. This is not just strange, it requires an explanation that official history has never provided. Inside the castle, there's a smell that no one describes in tourist brochures. Imagine entering a medieval castle, not through the museum's grand entrance, with a ticket office and souvenir shop, but as people who lived there entered it. Not into restored halls with signs and lighting, but into the real space of a real 10th century castle. The first thing that will greet you is the smell. Not the romantic smell of stone and antiquity that guidebooks like to describe. The smell of rotting organic matter, stagnant water, damp straw, and everything that several dozen people produce daily in a confined stone space without proper ventilation and without any waste disposal system. This is the first thing historical chronicles record when talking about castle life. The smell is always the smell. The floors in castle halls were covered with reeds and straw. This is a historically confirmed fact, usually presented as a charming domestic detail. In reality, it was a forced measure, the only available technology to combat what accumulated on the stone floors daily. Food scraps from banquet tables fell onto the straw. So did the excrement of dogs, which were kept by the dozens in castles. So did spilled drink remnants, bones, candle grease, and everything else that human habitation produces. Fresh straw was laid on top of the old, without removing the lower layers. Thomas More, in the 16th century, described castle floors where the lower layers of straw had not been changed for years and had turned into a compacted mass of decomposed organic matter. This is not the unsanitary conditions of the poor, it's the everyday reality of aristocratic residences. This is what archaeologists discover during excavations of castle floors. The organic layer beneath the final covering, in several well-studied castles, reaches a thickness of several tens of centimeters. Analysis of this layer reveals the presence of parasites, helminth eggs, insect remains, traces of rodents in concentrations characteristic of long-term unmanaged accumulation. These are not random finds. This is a systemic picture, reproduced in the material of castles across Europe, from English to Polish, from French to Spanish. Everywhere the same thing. Everywhere the same organic sediment of years of accumulation. Castle walls sweated. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is the physical reality of stone buildings without proper ventilation and with minimal window openings. The narrow arrow slits, which served excellent military purposes, were catastrophically incapable of ventilating living spaces. Condensation settled on the walls year-round. Mold spread across the stonework. Chronicles describe constant dampness as a habitual background of castle life, not as an emergency, but as a norm that people simply put up with. Tapestries and fabric drapes, which covered the walls, served not only decorative purposes. They were an attempt to create at least some barrier between living humans and the constantly weeping stone. This also applies to heating, which in castles was organized in a way that a modern person would perceive as mockery. A central hearth in the Great Hall provided heat within a radius of a few meters around it, and practically did not warm the rest of the hall's space, let alone the adjacent rooms. Smoke from the hearth, in the absence of a proper chimney, partially escaped through the opening in the ceiling, partially remained inside. Soot settled on the walls, ceiling, clothes, and the lungs of the inhabitants. Analysis of skeletal remains of people who lived in castles reveals characteristic respiratory pathologies, a consequence of years of inhaling smoke in closed stone rooms. Wealthy people, the castle owners, had more damaged lungs than peasants living in wooden houses with properly designed stoves. Kitchens in castles were located in separate buildings or towers, not for fire safety reasons, although that was also a factor, but because the smell and heat from constantly operating hearths made being near the kitchen unbearable. Waste from kitchen production, bones, offal, spoiled food were thrown into special pits in the castle courtyard or directly outside the walls. In hot weather, the smell from these pits spread throughout the castle grounds. Medieval documents record attempts to regulate this at the level of castle statutes, prescribing where exactly to dispose of waste. But practice shows that these prescriptions were followed inconsistently. Here is the picture that is not painted in tourist brochures. Not fairy tale halls with stained glass and knights in polished armor, but damp stone walls covered in soot and condensation, floors with a multi-year layer of compacted organic matter, a constant smell that could not be escaped by incense, herbs, or resin. All of this was also used and still didn't help. People who had colossal resources and political power lived in conditions that any modern sanitary inspector would deem unfit for habitation without a second thought. The question is not whether it was like that. The question is why it was like that. Why could people who could build a Gothic cathedral with precise engineering calculations not, or not want to, make their homes simply habitable? There was no sewage in castles. This statement sounds simple, but behind it lies an anomaly that shatters the familiar logic of medieval history. There was no sewage in the sense that engineers and sanitary doctors understand the word. That is, there was no organized system for collecting, removing, and disposing of human waste for people constantly residing in the building. Garderobes existed in castles. This is what medieval documents called toilet niches, built into the thickness of the wall and opening outward, overhanging the moat, the slope of the hill, or simply an open space near the wall. This was the entire sanitary infrastructure of a structure where dozens, and during a siege, hundreds of people lived permanently. Calculate it yourself. The average garrison of an active European castle during its period of active use was from 50 to 150 men, plus servants, plus the owner's family, plus constant guests and visitors. Thus, from 100 to 300 people were in the building simultaneously. For this entire contingent, there were at most 4 to 8 toilet niches. In Bodiam Castle, which was thoroughly researched by British archaeologists in the 20th century, 33 toilet niches were discovered for a castle complex designed for the permanent residence of several hundred people. At first glance, not bad, but all these niches opened directly into the moat. A single moat, enclosed, without flowing water, without any mechanism for cleaning or refreshing its contents. This applies to a fundamental problem that historians usually sidestep as quickly as possible. The moat surrounding the castle, in reality, quickly turned into an open septic tank of colossal scale. The water in it did not change, a closed loop without a source and without an outlet. Kitchen waste also ended up there, so did sewage from the courtyard during rains, so did dead animals. During the summer, a distinct aroma emanated from the moat, a smell noted in historical records as a commonplace occurrence. In winter, its contents would partially freeze, serving as the sole natural deodorizer available to the castle's inhabitants. The moat's defensive integrity was thus compromised in the most literal sense. No one truly desired to traverse it. This extends to what transpired within the castle when utilizing designated alcoves for bodily functions became impossible or inconvenient for any reason. Chronicles, legal documents, and monastic records attest to practices that a modern individual would perceive as a sign of complete societal breakdown. People would relieve themselves in any available corner of the structure, not out of rudeness, but out of necessity. In a vast, cold castle, venturing to a latrine recess at night, navigating through several halls and staircases constituted a significant journey. Consequently, the practice of using chamber pots emerged, their contents subsequently emptied out of windows or into nearby courtyards. 10th century documents governing life in English castles contain explicit instructions for servants to clear waste from the corners of residential areas. The very existence of such directives implies there was indeed waste to be cleared, and from these locations. Now for a second, more perplexing question. In several castles, remnants of drainage systems have been discovered. Pipes, channels, and components that by their shape and placement could have served either drainage or sewage functions. Herein lies the true enigma. These systems were non-operational. They were deliberately blocked, buried, or incorporated into the stonework in such a way as to render their functional use impossible. They were not ruined by time, they were actively obstructed. At Rochester Castle in Kent, one of England's most thoroughly studied Norman fortresses, restoration work in the 10th century revealed vertical shafts within the walls, the purpose of which sparked debate among researchers. Some of these clearly served a ventilation or drainage role and had been intentionally sealed at a specific point in the building's history. This observation aligns with a systemic pattern noted in the examination of numerous European castles. Their designs incorporate elements that could have provided adequate ventilation and waste removal, yet these were either never used as intended or were rendered inoperable early in the structure's existence. This phenomenon defies military logic, as proper ventilation and sanitation do not diminish a fortification's defensive capabilities. It also defies economic logic. Those who invested resources in constructing massive stone walls were unlikely to be economizing on construction in general. Nor does it align with technical incompetence, given that contemporaries of these castles erected monasteries equipped with functioning water systems. Only one explanation remains, one that historians traditionally overlook because it disrupts too much of what we understand. The people who inhabited these castles did not know how to use the facilities built into them. They did not grasp the purpose of these constructions. They did not build the castles themselves, they occupied them and adapted them for habitation as best they could, without understanding the original intent behind their creation. This is not a metaphor or fantasy, it is the sole hypothesis that accounts for all the anomalies simultaneously. The filth, the blocked shafts, and the absence of sewage systems in buildings where their traces are still evident. It gives the impression that the castles were not designed for habitation. Even researchers disinclined towards unconventional interpretations cautiously formulate this conclusion, driven by the weight of evidence. They find themselves unable to dismiss the cumulative observations we have examined through standard explanations. The dirt was attributed to the era, the lack of sanitation to military priorities, and the blocked shafts to later renovations. Each individual observation received a localized explanation. However, when these explanations are assembled into a single narrative, the picture fails to cohere. It fragments. Let us establish a concrete list of observations, each of which is documented and not disputed by serious historians. First, castles were constructed with immense expenditures of resources and time. From 5 to 20 years of continuous building, involving hundreds or thousands of laborers and vast quantities of stone, timber, and metal. Second, despite these costs, the basic sanitary infrastructure within the castles was either absent or designed in such a way that it could not cope with the demands, even with a minimal number of inhabitants. Third, contemporary structures like monasteries, Arab cities, and certain European urban districts exhibit fully functional engineering solutions for water supply and sanitation. Fourth, in several castles, structural elements have been discovered that could have served drainage or ventilation purposes, but were not utilized as intended. Fifth, the living conditions within castles were poorer than in any other type of contemporary structure, including peasant dwellings and monastic cells. This relates to the fundamental logic of construction, which has remained consistent throughout the Middle Ages and before and after. Any structure is built for a specific purpose, and that purpose dictates the design. If a building is intended for permanent human habitation, provisions for heating, ventilation, water supply, and sanitation are included. If these are absent, then permanent human habitation was not the intended function for which the structure was designed. This is not a revolutionary concept. It is the ABC of architectural analysis. When applied to castles, it yields the same result regardless of their location in Europe. Consider what castles were truly well suited for. Walls from 2 to 4 meters thick are excessive for residential purposes, but optimal for protection against external forces. Minimal window openings are disastrous for a living space in terms of light and ventilation, but ideal for a structure that must present no vulnerable points in its outer walls. Towers with panoramic views are useless for habitation, but indispensable for surveillance and perimeter control. Underground chambers with thick vaults, uncomfortable for living, are excellent for storing items requiring stable temperatures and protection. Drawbridges and portcullises are superfluous for a family residence, but essential for an establishment where access must be strictly controlled. This pertains to what architects term the functional profile of a building. Every structural element is an answer to a specific question. What is supposed to happen here? The functional profile of a castle, when honestly interpreted, describes not a feudal lord's residence, but something fundamentally different. A structure with strict access control, protection of its contents from external influence, capacity for prolonged autonomous operation, subterranean storage, and a system for perimeter observation. This describes a non-residential building, a special-purpose facility. What kind specifically? That is a question official history prefers not to answer. Compare this to the appearance of actual medieval aristocratic residences, not castles, but manorial homes. A typical dwelling for a moderately prosperous landowner would feature large windows, a central hearth with a properly constructed chimney, outbuildings for utilitarian purposes with functional cesspits, and a garden or orchard nearby. This is space organized around the needs of the person living there. This is a dwelling. A castle is not this. A castle is something else that people adapted for habitation because nothing more suitable was available. A pause, because what follows enters territory that official scholarship prefers to avoid. If castles were not built as residences, then who built them, when, and for what purpose? There are 3 answers, and all are uncomfortable. First, they were built by the same people who later inhabited them, who simply lacked understanding. However, this contradicts the engineering complexity of the structures themselves. Such sophistication is not accidental. Second, they were deliberately constructed as military installations, with comfort intentionally sacrificed for defensibility. But this does not explain the deliberately blocked engineering features, nor why military installations would be built in locations lacking strategic heights, vital roads, or water sources. The third answer, the one not spoken aloud, we will examine in the next part. Among researchers often labeled as proponents of alternative history, or more accurately, individuals posing questions that academic science fails to answer clearly, a theory has long circulated and deserves far more serious consideration than it typically receives. The theory posits, medieval castles were not constructed by those who lived in them. They were built much earlier by a different civilization for different purposes. And what we refer to as medieval castle occupation is, in reality, the story of people finding alien structures after some global catastrophic event and adapting them to their own needs to the extent their understanding allowed. Let us begin by stating that this theory does not necessitate assumptions that contradict physics or common sense. It requires only one thing: acknowledging that the established chronology we are taught may contain errors, and that prior to the period we call the Middle Ages, a civilization possessing a technological level significantly exceeding that attributed to medieval builders might have existed in Europe. A civilization that erected structures for specific industrial, administrative, or other specialized needs, and then vanished rapidly, catastrophically, and so completely that it left no written testament to its existence nor any living carriers of knowledge about the purpose of what it built. This relates to specific architectural characteristics that under this interpretation gain a logical explanation. Walls 2 to 4 meters thick are excessive for medieval military defense against any weapon of the era. Catapults and rams did not necessitate such protection. Thinner city walls could withstand them. However, such thickness is quite rational for an industrial facility where processes requiring thermal, acoustic, or other forms of isolation were taking place. The subterranean chambers with perfectly aligned vaults found beneath many castles, such as the extensive basement systems under Château Gaillard in Normandy or Sternberg Castle in Switzerland, lack a convincing explanation within a military or residential function, but fit well within the logic of a technological or storage facility. The vertical shafts within the walls, which we mentioned previously, are a separate matter. At Dover Castle, one of England's most meticulously studied fortresses, restoration work in the 20th century documented shafts and channels within the masonry, officially explained as ventilation or drainage. However, their design, diameter, and placement do not correspond to any known medieval engineering solution for these purposes. They are considerably more complex than required for ventilating a living space, and they were deliberately blocked using the same stone as the main construction at an early stage of the building's history. The people who lived in the castle sealed away what they did not understand. This is the only explanation that aligns with the physical facts. This also applies to the placement of castles, which, upon careful examination, often defies military strategic explanation. Classical military logic dictates that a fortified object should be situated on dominant heights, near crossings, at road intersections, or close to water sources. A significant portion of European castles do not meet this criterion. Castles are located in lowlands without strategic views, off roads and trade routes, in places lacking military or economic logic for their establishment. They stand where they stand, and this can only be explained in one way. They were not chosen as construction sites, they were found already standing and occupied. The industrial hypothesis also explains the specifics of internal layouts. Large halls with high ceilings, commonly interpreted as grand reception areas, function as workspaces from an industrial perspective. High ceilings are necessary where large objects are handled or where a substantial volume of air is required. A multi-level structure with connecting passages and staircases between levels is not residential architecture. It is industrial or storage. Thick floors between levels, capable of bearing significant loads, are excessive for a dwelling, but necessary for storing heavy materials or operating heavy equipment. The hypothesis regarding the prison function of some castles also fits this logic. Strict access control, isolated cells, windowless subterranean chambers. All are present in castles and are necessary for feudal dwellings, but essential for a correctional facility. The pre-cataclysm civilization hypothesis is neither new nor as marginal as it is often portrayed. Serious researchers, geologists, architects, and historians operating outside the academic mainstream have accumulated significant observations indicating a temporal void in Europe's history that official chronology fills unconvincingly. The period between the supposed end of antiquity and the beginning of what is termed the Middle Ages, roughly from the 4th century AD, is characterized in most European regions by a drastic reduction in artifacts, a sharp decline in construction quality, and a significant simplification of social organization. This was not a gradual decline, but a rupture, after which people began to build, trade, and organize anew, albeit at a considerably lower level than before, utilizing structures they had not built themselves. Many suspect, though they do not know for certain and cannot articulate it clearly, that something in the official historical narrative does not add up. that there is a gap between the lines of textbooks that no one is eager to fill. The question of who built all of this before us has been posed by too many people in too many places to be dismissed as paranoia or a lack of education. A civilization existed in Europe before what we call the Middle Ages, possibly more than one, possibly significantly more advanced than the one that succeeded it. And it vanished, not gradually faded or dissolved into neighboring cultures, but disappeared rapidly, leaving behind almost no trace, only stone. Official history explains the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages through the concept of the gradual decline of the Roman Empire. A neat theory. A great civilization slowly weakens under the pressure of external enemies and internal contradictions, eventually disintegrates, and a new, more primitive, but gradually strengthening era begins on its ruins. The problem with this theory is that it does not align with the physical evidence. Cities that housed several 100,000 people during Rome's Golden Age show signs of only a few thousand inhabitants in the 7th century AD. Not a gradual reduction, but a collapse. Metalworking, construction, and ceramic production technologies characteristic of the late antique period do not merely simplify in the early Middle Ages, they disappear and re-emerge centuries later, as if people rediscovered what their predecessors already knew. This relates to what geologists and soil scientists discover in European cultural layers. In several regions of Europe, between layers corresponding to the late antique period and the early Middle Ages, a distinct stratum is identified. A sterile layer devoid of artifacts, organic matter, or traces of human activity, sometimes thin, sometimes of considerable thickness. Geologists interpret such sterile layers as evidence of catastrophic events. Large-scale floods, volcanic eruptions, continental fires, or other processes capable of simultaneously destroying organic matter over vast areas. This is not an interpretation by alternative historians, it is standard geological methodology applied to the European cultural layer. Dendrochronology, the science of dating events by annual tree rings, records several years in the 6th century AD with abnormally narrow growth rings. This indicates a sharp cooling and reduction in sunlight, signs of either a massive volcanic eruption spewing enough ash into the atmosphere to block solar radiation, or the impact of a large celestial body. Byzantine and Chinese chronicles from the 6th century describe several years when the sun shone without warmth and harvests failed worldwide. This event, known in scientific literature as the catastrophe of 636 AD or the late antique Little Ice Age, is real. It is documented in independent sources on 3 continents. It occurred, and its consequences for the population of Europe were catastrophic. This illustrates what any sufficiently large-scale natural disaster does to a civilization. It does not destroy stone. The stone remains. Buildings, roads, canals, bridges, everything constructed before the catastrophe endures. The carriers of knowledge about how it was built and for what purpose vanish with the population. And the next generation, arriving at the site decades or centuries later, finds ready-made structures whose meaning is incomprehensible to them. This is precisely what happened with castles. People found them standing. They did not know who built them. They did not know for what purpose. They knew only one thing: one could take shelter inside. And so they sheltered. Observe how medieval chroniclers describe certain castles and fortresses upon their first mention in documents. A characteristic phrasing, an ancient structure, a fortification, existing from time immemorial, a fortress built by unknown hands in ancient times. These phrases appear in early medieval chronicles, referring to structures that official dating attributes to the same period or slightly earlier. The contradiction is obvious. If a castle was built 200 years ago, it is not a structure of time immemorial to someone living 200 years later. This phrasing implies one thing: the chronicler writing did not know when it was built, because it was built long before his civilization, long before anything he could remember or ask elders about. The civilization that built castles was not primitive. It was advanced enough to erect multi-story stone structures with complex internal layouts, integrated shafts and channels, and subterranean chambers with precisely calculated, load-bearing capacities for their vaults. Yet, it left behind not a single text, not a single image, not a single object that could be confidently attributed to it. This in itself is an anomaly. Civilizations do not disappear without a trace in the natural course of history. They leave artifacts, linguistic traces, genetic footprints, mythological reflections. If there are almost no traces, it means the disappearance was not gradual. It means it was rapid, and that what caused it was significant enough to destroy not only the people, but also most of what they left behind. Except the stone. The stone remained. We live in it to this day and call it our medieval heritage. Everything we have discussed thus far could be relegated to the realm of speculative constructs. Interesting, logical, but unprovable. It could be, were it not for one circumstance. What we refer to as a hypothesis about medieval Europe has already occurred in our time. Not in the distant past, nor in a legendary epoch that defies verification, but literally within the lifespan of the last 2 to 3 generations in a country that exists on the map right now. And this can be verified independently, without specialized knowledge, without access to classified archives, simply by typing 2 words into a search engine. The Johannesburg effect. Johannesburg is the largest city in the Republic of South Africa and the center of the Gauteng province, which is the most economically developed territory on the entire African continent. It was here, at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries, that one of the world's largest gold mining and processing operations was concentrated. A massive industrial infrastructure was built under and around the city. Mines, processing plants, technical structures, ventilation shafts, pumping stations, warehouses, and administrative buildings. All of this was erected with a specific industrial purpose, with engineering calculations tailored to that purpose, and with equipment without which these buildings would have lost all meaning. Then the industrial cycle concluded. Some enterprises closed, some equipment was removed, and some structures were abandoned. And this is where what researchers have termed the Johannesburg effect begins. People who found themselves near these structures, having no connection to their construction or initial use, began to occupy them as residences. They moved into industrial buildings, dividing the vast workshop spaces with makeshift partitions. They settled into technical rooms originally intended for machinery, not people. They set up kitchens in ventilation chambers and lived in buildings without proper water supply, sanitation, or heating, because these buildings were never designed for residential function. This touches upon the very essence of the phenomenon that urban studies researchers and anthropologists studying this process are documenting. The people who occupied the industrial sites did not understand their purpose. They saw walls, a roof, and space, and used it as housing because housing was needed, and this was accessible. The technical structures, incomprehensible to the new inhabitants, were ignored, dismantled, or misused. Ventilation systems, calculated for industrial processes, were ineffective at providing fresh air for living spaces because they were designed for a different purpose. Drainage systems, built for industrial wastewater, proved useless for residential use or created new problems because the parameters of wastewater from an industrial plant and a residential building are fundamentally different. This applies to the details that, when compared to castles, create a sense of recognition. In the Johannesburg industrial sites occupied as residences, the same problems were recorded as in medieval castles. Accumulation of household waste without a proper disposal system. inability to ensure adequate ventilation in spaces not designed for constant human presence, use of auxiliary technical rooms as living quarters, and a complete lack of understanding by the new inhabitants about the intended purpose of various structural elements. The picture replicates with astonishing accuracy 800 years later on another continent in a completely different cultural context. Because the logic is the same. When people without the necessary knowledge inhabit a structure built for other purposes, the result is always the same. Let's consider the parallels. A medieval knight in a castle, not understanding why there are walled-up shafts in the wall, and a resident of a Johannesburg industrial complex, not understanding why there are metal rails in the floor for ore transport. A medieval servant pouring waste into a courtyard corner because the sewage channel is blocked and incomprehensible, and a new occupant of an industrial building throwing garbage down a ventilation shaft because there is no garbage chute, and this is just an opening in the floor. A medieval chronicler describing a castle as a structure from time immemorial, and a modern resident of a slum with no idea that the building around them was constructed as a processing plant. The Johannesburg effect is valuable precisely because it is observable, documented, and happening in real time. It provides us with a working model of a process that we could otherwise only hypothesize about. And this model shows people who occupy foreign structures without understanding their purpose leave no evidence of this misunderstanding. They simply live, poorly, uncomfortably, in conditions utterly unsuited for habitation, but they live. And if, after 800 years, historians were to study the traces of their presence in these buildings, they would find precisely what we find in medieval castles. People who lived in structures clearly not intended for habitation, did not understand their design, and left behind a layer of organic waste atop unfamiliar infrastructure they did not comprehend. Verify it yourself. Type these 2 words into your search engine. Look at the photographs. Read the descriptions, and then recall everything you've learned about medieval castles in the last few minutes, and ask yourself, isn't this the same story, just told at different times and in different settings? Alright, since we've come this far, let's voice what many are thinking but few utter. What if castles were built as shelters from dragons? Laughing? Rightly so. But hold your laughter for precisely 30 seconds, because this question, posed seriously, opens up something interesting. Not about dragons, but about us. About how we decide what is an acceptable question and what isn't, and about who exactly makes that decision for us. The dragon, as a creature, appears in the mythology of virtually all cultures on Earth, independently, without possibility of cultural borrowing. The Chinese dragon, the European dragon, the Scandinavian worm, the serpent from Slavic legends, the Leviathan from Middle Eastern texts. A creature of immense size, capable of flight, often fire-breathing or venomous, posing a mortal threat to humans. This image is reproduced in cultures that never interacted. Anthropologists explain this through archetypal fears embedded in the human psyche by evolution. The fear of a predator from above, the fear of a large reptilian creature. This explanation is valid, but it's not the only one. This relates to what paleontology knows about large flying reptiles that actually existed. Pterosaurs, the flying lizards of the Mesozoic era, had wingspans of up to 10 to 12 meters. Quetzalcoatlus, the largest known pterosaur, with a wingspan of about 10 to 11 meters, weighed, according to various estimates, from 200 to 250 kilograms. This is not a sparrow. This is a creature that could physically pose a threat to humans. Official science dates the extinction of pterosaurs to 66 million years ago. But official science also told us that coelacanths went extinct 70 million years ago, until, in 1938, a live coelacanth was caught off the coast of South Africa. The list of creatures declared extinct and then found alive is long enough to treat categorical statements about species extinction with some caution. Medieval bestiaries, illustrated descriptions of animals created in monasteries from the 10th century onwards, describe dragons alongside other creatures, lions, elephants, crocodiles, unicorns. The compilers of bestiaries did not distinguish between real and fantastical animals in the modern sense. For them, all these creatures were equally real. Some lived nearby, others in distant lands. A crocodile, for a 10th century European monk, was as exotic and potentially fantastical a creature as a dragon. The only difference is that the crocodile was later confirmed, and the dragon was not. But this does not mean that the author of a bestiary describing a dragon was describing a fictional creature. They were describing what they believed to be real, based on sources they considered reliable. This also applies to the analysis of castle architecture. From this unexpected perspective, if we assume, purely as a thought experiment, that a large flying creature posed a real threat to humans during a certain historical period, then castle architecture gains an additional explanation for several of its features. Minimal window openings, stone floors between stories rather than wooden ones. Enclosed courtyards accessible only through gatehouses in the walls. Towers with panoramic views, allowing observation of the surrounding airspace. Each of these elements has an explanation within standard military logic, but each is also compatible with the logic of defense against a threat coming from above. This is not proof, it is an observation, and an observation has the right to be voiced. Now, why is this question even worth asking, even with a smile? Because the reaction to it is telling. Tell someone that castles might have been built as industrial sites before a cataclysmic civilization, and you'll receive condescending skepticism. Say that castles might have been built as shelters from dragons, and you'll get laughter. But both versions, from the standpoint of evidence, are in roughly the same position. Each has indirect arguments, each lacks direct proof. The only difference is that one sounds serious and the other does not. And it is precisely this distinction between serious and not serious, between acceptable and unacceptable, that is imposed on us from outside. By someone who cares about precisely which questions we ask, and who cares that we do not ask certain questions at all. Laugh at dragons, it's normal. But while you're laughing, don't forget that laughter is also a way to shut down a conversation. The same mechanism we've already discussed. When there are no arguments, laughter comes. When there's no answer to a question, the question is declared unserious. It works the same way, both when it comes to dragons and when it comes to something far more important. Smile and keep thinking. That is the only thing that is requested here. We've taken castles apart brick by brick, walked through the dirt and smell, through blocked shafts and missing sewage, through pre-cataclysmic civilization and the Johannesburg effect, through dragons and mechanisms of suppressing inconvenient questions. This was one version, consistent, based on documented facts, logically constructed. But it is still just a version, and you surely have your own. Perhaps you watched this material and at some point thought, no, it's simpler. Castles were built as military structures. People lived there because there were no other options. And this whole story about a pre-cataclysmic civilization is a beautiful but unprovable construct. That is an honest position. It has a right to exist, provided you can explain the blocked shafts, explain the absence of sewage, despite the resources for its construction, explain the chronicler's phrasing about structures from time immemorial. If you have an explanation, write it down. Seriously, not as trolling, but as an argument. This is precisely what comments are for. This relates to the fundamental principle on which this channel is built. We do not sell ready-made answers. Ready-made answers are already sold in sufficient quantities. In textbooks, in news, in official guides to tourist castles, with ticket booths and souvenir shops. Everything is laid out, explained, polished to a state where no inconvenient question can sprout. We do something else. We ask questions and invite you to ask them with us. Perhaps your version about castles is entirely different. Perhaps you have encountered a specific castle, specific excavations, specific documents, and you have information that we do not. This is not an exception and not uncommon. Among the people who watch this channel are historians, archaeologists, architects, people who live near castles and know more about them than any YouTube video can contain. If you are one of them, the comments are open. If you have a source, a link, an argument, an observation, leave it. This is not a rhetorical call for activity's sake. This is a real request for information. This relates to the broader question of how collective knowledge generally works. Knowledge that does not fit within official frameworks, but is accumulated somewhere on the periphery, in conversations, in personal observations, in family stories. A person whose grandfather worked as a restorer at an old castle in Poland and told about findings that never made it anywhere. A person who studied medieval architecture and stumbled upon a structural element that defies classification. A person who simply lives in a city where a castle stands and sees it every day and has long noticed something in it that doesn't fit the plaque with the official description. All these people know something that we don't, and that is precisely why the conversation does not end here. The versions about the nature of castles, if you collect them all, are significantly more than two. Industrial sites, prisons, and places of forced confinement. Temple complexes of an unknown cult. Energy structures with an incomprehensible purpose. Shelters from a natural, biological, or other catastrophe. Military installations built for weapons unknown to us. Administrative centers of a civilization we haven't named. Each of these versions has its supporters. Each has arguments. None is definitively closed, because a definitive answer would require an honest revision of chronology and methodology, which official science is not yet ready for. Stones are silent, but they are silent in different ways, depending on what questions you ask them. We have asked several questions today. We received not answers, but clues, directions in which to look further. This is an honest outcome for a topic that is officially considered closed, but in reality is not closed from any serious perspective. That's all for now. If this material made you doubt, even for a second, what you knew about castles before, then it has done its job. If you watched until the end, then you are one of those for whom uncomfortable questions are more interesting than convenient answers. There are fewer such people than you might think. And that is precisely why this channel exists. Click like. Not because it's customary, but because the algorithm works against materials that ask uncomfortable questions. Every like is a vote for such conversations to continue. Subscribe if you haven't already. The next episode will be out soon. The topic will be no less uncomfortable. And click the bell. Without it, the platform simply won't show you new material. It won't ask, it won't warn, it simply won't show. You already know how such systems work. Your version in the comments. We await it.